his last meal before facing the terrible fate of death row is a rather morbid ritual. But come on, we've all asked ourselves the very important question of what we would choose for our last meal. Well, we've got you covered with the absolute weirdest last meal requests in prison. I'm your host, Isabella. Let's get into the countdown. Let's start with a request that includes dinner and a movie or three. 25 years after committing a violent crime, 49-year-old Ronnie Lee Gardner absolutely insisted upon a very grand last meal. Gardner ordered a steak and lobster with vanilla ice cream and apple pie, and what took the request even further was that Gardner wished to watch the famous Lord of the Rings trilogy during his meal. We know his request was approved, however we're not too sure if he was allowed to watch all three movies, if that's even possible in one sitting. Moving along, we have a criminal with a very simple yet specific last meal order. After a violent rampage, Ricky Ray Rector was finally caught and given the maximum penalty, putting him on death row in 1992. For his last meal, Rector asked for a simple slice of pie and a drink of Kool-Aid. When he was done eating, a bit of pie was left on the plate, and before being taken to his life's end, he said to a watching guard that he was saving the rest for later, laughed, left the room, and received lethal injection. It doesn't get any more sinister. Moving along to our next wild last meal with inmate Troy Davis. Troy was so convinced he would not face his penalty that when asked for his last meal, he simply said he wanted nothing, and that his meal would not be his last anyway. Davis was a religious man who, despite taking someone's life, had hoped something for himself, something better, and wanted to make some kind of a point. In the end, we don't really know if Davis was ever given a meal in the afterlife, but we do know that he definitely wasn't open to any options that the prison would have provided. Now, let's talk about probably one of the more entitled criminals on the list, Thomas Grasso. Unlike Troy Davis, Grasso ordered pretty much everything you'd find in a fully stocked buffet. His requests included steamed clams and mussels, fruit, ribs, burgers, many milkshakes, pumpkin pie, and finally, a can of SpaghettiOs. Unfortunately, the prison had a slight mishap with Grasso's order, which led to his famous words, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti, I want the press to know this." I don't really think the press could do much with that information, but I personally would have been just fine with the spaghetti. And that takes us to our next one on the list, with a prisoner who turned his execution into a celebration. In 2001, 46-year-old Miguel Richardson decided before he received lethal injection that he'd like a birthday cake. To add even more sentimental value, he specifically needed his wedding anniversary written in icing on the cake and 7 pink candles. To make it a complete meal, Richardson added fruit and a salad topped with Thousand Island dressing. Sounds like a very uneventful party though. Next, we have one of the most spiteful last meal requests from one of our most dangerous prisoners. Nicknamed the one-man slaughterhouse, Delbert T. Jr. was an aggressive criminal that we should be glad was put behind bars. However, this evil scheming did not end after he was caught. To play on his nickname, the human slaughterhouse ordered a beefy burger. When the time came, T actually refused to eat the meal until his mother told him to. Interesting family dynamic for sure. And moving on to another impossible request made in the year 2000. After committing a deadly home robbery, construction worker Odell Barnes' case became a media frenzy. Many human rights activists believed the man was innocent because the entire case was said to be based on one man's testimony, who was a witness who saw Barnes outside of the victim's home. An organization supporting Barnes said that the police investigation was totally botched and the prisoner was being wrongfully convicted. The courts did not feel the need to look into this for reasons unknown, but when asked what he wanted for his last meal, he simply said justice, equality, and world peace. You can probably assume that was not handed to him on a metal tray that day though. Next, up, we have a prisoner whose concern for their health followed them all the way to their last meal. Since he had the choice of anything he wanted, 76-year-old Clarence Ray Allen, the second oldest prisoner actually ever given the lethal maximum penalty, chose sugar-free walnut ice cream. No one knows exactly why Allen wasn't fond of sugar in his ice cream, but needless to say, it was a request that certainly stood out among others. Moving along to the smallest food item on the list. A prisoner once requested their last meal to be one black olive. Many questions come to mind here, and 62-year-old Robert Buell left us scratching our heads big time. Considering the heinous nature of his crimes that are too horrid to even mention, it begins to make more sense as to why Buell would leave this world on such a bizarre note. On his final day, which was September of 2002. Next on the list is a prisoner who had a thing for hard candy. 33-year-old Gerald Lee Mitchell was finally being punished for a violent and senseless crime he committed when he was only 17 during a volatile exchange of illegal narcotics. In 2001, it came time for Mitchell to face the consequences. But first, it was time for his last meal. For this, he requested a bag of Jolly Ranchers, and we are not sure if he was able to get through the whole bag. And that concludes our list of the weirdest last meal requests made in prison, and thank you for joining us today. So, what would you choose?